pluralists, I argue that in fact they also appeal to bigots, because in some contexts pluralism can directly strengthen bigotry. So my work consists of I guess, two main argumentative pillars. The first is that pluralist performances are what I refer to as ambigrammatic, meaning a single object that looks different from where you're standing. Ambigrammatic signifiers that appeal to both pluralist and bigoted audiences, meaning that the same pluralist performance will appear different if a bigot is looking at it or if a pluralist is looking at it. I will explain these terms, I promise. Now, this ambigrammaticism allows bigots to speak as broadly as possible, appealing to both core bigoted constituencies and potential pluralist supporters without alienating either. Now, the second pillar of my argument, which I guess is the real core of the project and which I will be speaking mostly about today, is that pluralism appeals to bigoted audiences because pluralism is directly commensurable with bigotry. I argue that the conceptual commensurability of pluralism and bigotry, which is essentially a question of scale, allows bigots to strategically mobilise what I call weaponised pluralism. Weaponised pluralism is a political strategy where performances of pluralism reinforce ethno-religious hierarchies. And I argue that it does so through three main mechanisms that kind of are the grist of the project and will be the grist of today's presentation: subservience, categorisation, and co-optation. Now, given the time constraints today, I am going to gloss over the first pillar of this argument in favour of the second one. And I'm going to begin by talking about, obviously very briefly, my terminology, some very brief political theoretical framing, before jumping into models of multiple messaging and why the Munch offers insights into a new model, weaponised pluralism. And then the second half of the presentation will be on these mechanisms of weaponised pluralism. Now, before I go too much further, it is probably worthwhile clarifying what exactly the RSS and the Munch are and what I mean by bigots and pluralists. Now, in the interest of time, I am just going to give you, I guess, the highlights reel of the RSS. Now, the RSS, or the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the National Volunteer Corps, is the organisational mothership of the broader Hindu nationalist movement and is the largest far-right organisation in the world. With approximately 7 million active members, it is variously described as a paramilitary militia, a service provision organisation, a cultural movement, or an electoral body through its political wing, the BJP, the current ruling party of India, led by Narendra Modi. Now, the RSS and its vast network of civil society organisational appendages maintain ideological commitments to its core political philosophy, Hindutva, often translated as Hinduness. Now, I don't have time today to really dissect the intricacies of Hindutva, but very crudely, its proponents hold that to be Hindu, whether that's defined religiously, culturally, or ancestrally, is, or at least should be, coterminous with being Indian. Accordingly, those who say, I am not Hindu, cannot be Indian, and therefore must be dealt with because they are foreign. And those to be dealt with, while not exclusively, tend to be Muslims. The Hindu nationalist movement is antagonistically defined in relation to India's large Muslim minority. What dealing with Muslims looks like for the RSS has varied over time, ranging from open calls to genocidal extermination, to recognition of coexistence, to the notorious coordination of large-scale riots and the implicit sponsoring of anti-Muslim vigilante violence in the name of cow protection. Now, the RSS has consistently positioned itself in opposition to Muslims since its inception. There are no serious questions about it having fundamentally changed. It remains committed to this antagonism. Its affiliates still terrorise Muslims. It still calls on infiltrators, code for Bangladeshi migrants, to be expelled. It still questions the national loyalties of anyone with a Muslim last name. It still helps write legislation that makes Indian Muslims stateless, and it still helps build concentration camps in which to house them. All of this makes it quite surprising then that since December 2002, the RSS has had a Muslim wing of about 10,000 members. Like the RSS, the Munch is difficult to define, and in my fieldwork it was described by members as a social organisation, a charity, again, a cultural movement, a welfare provider, and as a lobby group. And it certainly contains elements of all of those things. But I think more useful than putting one of these kind of labels on it is paying closer attention to the things that it actually does, which very broadly we can think of as two-dimensional service provision activities and performances of interfaith mixture. Now, to use the words of Munch members, Munch activities were articulated as the pursuit of bhaichara, samrasta, and sadbhavana, brotherhood, harmony, and goodwill, to reduce the duri, the distance between Hindus and Muslims. Now, what is bizarre is that these pluralist goals are appearing in the RSS, a violent Hindu nationalist organisation that has made its bread and butter through killing, terrorising, intimidating, undermining and abusing India's Muslims. We have this tension then where the RSS is clearly still committed to Muslim exclusion, but also that one of its constitutive bodies, the Munch, is advocating for a closer relationship between Muslims and the Hindu right, seeming to offer some kind of inclusion. And it's this tension between these competing impulses that really animates my work. Now, I use bigot in I guess like a sociological rather than a pejorative sense of the word, drawing on the work of Michael Billig and Tafel. I use bigot as someone who pursues an intense hatred that is a collectively experienced emotional acceleration of negative prejudice against a group. Now, given the RSS's well-documented history of anti-Muslim exclusion and violence, I'm going to take this label for the RSS as relatively uncontroversial, but obviously I'm happy to have that discussion in question time if people want to push back on that a bit. Pluralism is a bit more slipperier. The question of Muslims and the Hindu right is a question of cultural pluralism, more than it is, for example, of value pluralism or theological pluralism. Now, I don't use this term cultural pluralism to describe the fact of ethnic diversity, nor the process of diverse ethnic identification, nor policy initiatives used to harmonise group difference. I use it in perhaps a slightly older usage as an as yet unrealised social goal, which is usually understood as a minimalist commitment to the ideal that different proximate cultural groups should exist together and that they should do so unmolested. Now, there are a variety of different political goals used to achieve, political models used to achieve this goal, even in societies where we might be surprised to find commitments to cultural pluralism, such as in authoritarian states. But thanks to international regimes of colonialism, capitalism and globalisation, the most internationally weighty of these models, even if it is fragmented, vernacularised and uneven, is liberal pluralism. So liberal pluralism is, I guess, the terrain on which I do my theoretical work. And this is, don't spend too much brain power reading this very dense slide. But broadly speaking, it's a term that refers to a family of difference management models linked by the philosophical position that members of cultural groups are considered rights-bearing individuals before they are group members, and that difference should remain unmolested because its molestation would impact the rights of individuals. Now, large chunks of this book project are devoted to a political theoretical discussion of the intersections between liberal pluralism and bigotry and why these are applicable to India, but I'm not going to do a deep dive into these discussions because I'd like to keep you awake, and also because they're more of a way to frame my argument than substantiate it. But very quickly, basically I chime in on the debate between traditional liberal pluralists like John Rawls and their radical democratic critics like Chantal Mouffe, who criticise the inevitable partiality of liberal pluralist models and their commitment to obfuscating rather than mitigating power differentials between groups. Crudely, my personal political and intellectual sympathies lie with the radical democratic critics. However, I argue that they have unfairly characterised liberal pluralists as inattentive to power dynamics, which, when we consider the attention paid to power in the writings, particularly of multiculturalists, is a bit of a stretch. So the thrust of my political theoretical argument, then, is that for the radical democratic critique of liberal pluralism to be stronger, it must demonstrate not just that pluralism can be conservative and status quo, but exactly how it prosecutes that. This is then a call for fine-grained empiric work on the mechanisms of pluralism's conservatism, which coincidentally is where my research comes in. Now, my work hopefully does more than just provide an example of these ideas in practice. More than that, it reveals the way in which this conservatism of pluralism is not just structural and blind, but can actually be strategically used by actors like the RSS. Okay, I now release you from this political theoretical black hole and return to answering the core question of this thesis, which is why do bigots act like pluralists? Now, it seems like, to be as fair as possible, our first port of call has to be to take bigots at their word. Bigots act like pluralists because they're actually not really bigots, or perhaps they're no longer bigots. Bigots are acting like pluralists perhaps because they've changed. And this is certainly a large part of the public transcript of the Munch and the RSS. Of course, this dynamic invokes ideas of moderation and in turn the inclusion-moderation thesis that crudely argues that extremist groups moderate through participation in democratic processes. Could the RSS be moderating because its core bigotry has been eroded by democratic norms and the need to attract non-bigoted support for its electoral appendage, the BJP? In short, I think no. Despite RSS leader Mohan Bhagwat's recent platitudes, the RSS and its organisational appendages remain committed to Muslim exclusion, a lesson that in the last 3 years alone has been borne out through the legal annexation of Kashmir, the legislative platform of the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register of Citizens, the judicial victory for the Hindu nationalists who tore down the Babri Masjid, and the state-sponsored violence that we saw in Delhi in 2019 and 2020 against Muslims. Beyond that, if we zoom into the Munch, it quickly becomes apparent that not all is as it seems, and that large swaths of the Munch's public transcript are exaggerated or even fabricated, casting serious doubts on any claims that they make about RSS moderation. My fieldwork showed that far from the supposed 3 million members of the Munch, numbers were probably closer to around 10,000. It showed that even these members, these Munch members, often actually had no idea what the Munch was or that it existed beyond their neighbourhood. It also revealed that the Munch's service provision projects are more or less hollow facades that at best kind of speak to constituencies in the 10s and 20s rather than in the tens of thousands. My fieldwork showed that far from being attracted to a sincerely moderating RSS, Muslims joined the Munch to rebuke traditional centres of Muslim authority like the Congress Party in pursuit of government jobs, following the charisma of RSS Munch leader Indresh Kumar, who we will return to, or because they thought it would bolster their security in an India increasingly insecure for Muslims. Now, as a quick side note, I fully understand that these stories of Munch membership are in some ways the most interesting and compelling in this kind of story about the Munch, but I am going to have to disappoint you. To clarify, this project is about the organisational RSS, specifically its relationship with pluralism, which is embodied most powerfully in this appendage, the Munch. So that means that rather than a deep dive into the lives of Munch members, this is a project about RSS organisational political strategy. I am really happy to speak more in the questions about the lives of Munch members, how Munch members kind of creatively shaped their membership in the Munch and how they used the RSS for their own purposes, because that is a really important part of this story. Now, all of these kind of pieces of deception that I mentioned just above, coupled with a continuing RSS vitriol, make it really difficult for us to accept the public transcript of either the RSS or the Munch here, meaning that we need to kind of discard the possibility that the RSS are acting like pluralists because they suddenly love Muslims and that Muslims are suddenly loving the RSS in return. This assumption is supported by the volumes of evidence that organisations can insincerely, unevenly, or reversibly moderate. This then tells us that there is some multiple messaging going on. Now, when bigots appear to moderate, they risk alienating their core constituencies, the very people who are animated by bigotry. Bigots are then obviously faced with a problem. How do you appeal to a larger audience alienated by extreme bigotry while still maintaining the bigoted appeal that sustains your core? Appealing to multiple audiences with multiple messages at once is not an uncommon problem, especially in electoral politics. But what makes cases like the RSS and the Munch different is that the audiences are not just multiple. They are antagonistically divided by highly charged and symbolically loaded cleavages and defined against each other. So the RSS does not by itself have the problem of appealing to multiple electoral audiences, at least not directly. It does so through the BJP. However, because the RSS's driving political agenda is the complete socio-political transformation of the Indian polity into a Hindu ethno-state, they are deeply invested in as widespread public support as possible. So, bigots then act like pluralists as one potential answer to this problem of appealing to multiple audiences simultaneously. There are a number of existing kind of models for this multiple messaging, like surgical targeting or dog whistling, recuperation. But the main difference I'm proposing with weaponised pluralism, which I promise we are coming to, and other models of multiple messaging, is that in the other models there is always a true and a false message or meaning. And the point I want to make with weaponised pluralism is that pluralism is not just a mask for bigotry or to distract from bigotry, but that it contains, it's polysemic, it has these multiple meanings, and that pluralism can be bigotry. Pluralism and bigotry are commensurable because they are both systems of difference management that do not require the resolution of power imbalances between groups. Pluralism recognises the legitimacy of cultural difference, but is silent on systems of intergroup domination. Bigotry then can exist in conjunction with pluralist ideas because the silence of pluralism on domination provides conceptual space for the articulation of bigotry. Pluralist performances then can be pluralism and they can be bigotry. And I know I keep saying this without explaining how, but we are almost there. Now, the final thing that I want to talk about before jumping into the mechanisms of weaponised pluralism, how pluralism is bigotry, is the first pillar of my argument that I very briefly touched upon, which was that pluralism is ambigrammatic, that it appeals to pluralists and bigots without the actual performance of it morphologically changing. So the bulk of my work talks about how it appeals to bigots, but it doesn't really count as ambigrammatic if it doesn't also talk to pluralists. And I think very briefly that pluralism appeals to pluralists is not particularly surprising. By pluralists, I mean anyone who would not support the RSS in protest of its bigotry. They would withdraw support from the RSS because they disagreed with its bigotry. Now, the main pluralist audiences that I identified in my work were internal RSS moderates, BJP coalition partners, and a potential limited Muslim electorate. However, I'm not going to go into this into great detail because this is not really where my theoretical innovation or work lies, and nor is it, I think, the central impulse behind the munch. Okay, now, main event. Let's talk about weaponised pluralism, its three mechanisms and some stories from my fieldwork. So, put simply, weaponised pluralism is a political strategy that bigots use in which performances that ordinarily mark communal harmony, like interfaith prayer meetings, mutual aid, the celebration of intercommunal festivals, are instead designed to reinforce the dominance of one group over another. By weaponised pluralism, I mean performances of an ideal type cultural pluralism that are designed to publicly reinforce hierarchies rather than resolve them. Through the munch, the RSS cynically choreographs pluralist performances like Muslim prayers to Hindu gods in order to reinscribe the domination of Hindu nationalists over India's Muslims. Weaponised pluralism then is a tool that bigots, here the RSS, can use when extermination or expulsion of their declared ethno-religious other is not possible or desirable. Instead, this weaponised pluralism orders and manages cultural difference in the pursuit of something resembling Donald Horowitz's ranked ethnic system. So, the first mechanism of weaponised pluralism is how bigots make marginalised groups perform choreographed rituals of mixture that actually manifest as rituals of subservience. Now, I examine how the RSS does this by choreographing performances of religious mixture, of religious syncretism. But this kind of logic of mixture is transferable in a variety of ways, and I might touch upon that later if we have some time. Now, one key type of munch activity are events that are designed to display what's called the Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, or the composite culture of the Gangetic Plain. This usually means some flavour of religious syncretism. For the munch, this means Muslims performing Ram worship. It means religiously coded cow reverence of the Gaumata, or the sacred mother cow. It means Brahminical religiously coded vegetarianism and also the rejection of non-syncretic Islamic authority. During my fieldwork, I spoke to a Muslim Sanskrit professor who believed that Hindu religious texts, like the Puranas, came from the sky as revealed Islamic texts, like the Quran. He told me, as many in my fieldwork, that Lord Ram was actually a prophet of Islam, a Nabi of Islam. I attended Muslim prayer sessions to Lord Ram, and I fed cows at a Muslim-run Syncretic cow refuge. In Lucknow, I attended a Muslim rally calling for the construction of the disputed Ram temple on the site of the demolished mosque in Ayodhya. The final speaker for that evening was a stern Shia cleric in full regalia who led a crowd of Muslim men in a chant of Jai Shri Ram, victory to Lord Ram. What does this kind of interfaith devotional gesturing signal? What does it mean when an imam leads a crowd of Muslims in a victory chant for a Hindu god in whose name thousands of Muslims have been killed in genocidal violence? Now, the RSS kind of choreographs these performances of syncretism in the munch not to seek synthesis, not to kind of make Muslims Hindu, but to cement Muslim inferiority. The RSS does this by producing religious performances that lionize an abstracted good Hinduism and denigrate an abstracted bad Islam. These two poles then create a moral plane that stretches between good Hindu, bad Muslim, which Muslims are required to move along from one to the other. Syncretic practice, this kind of mixture, provides the conceptual rubric that allows that movement. But crucially, the aspirational pole of being Hindu is one that is intentionally left unattainable. The Muslim Rashtriya Manch would cease to have any purpose if they all became Hindus. It's important for the RSS that they remain Muslims. So syncretism allows Muslims to draw close to Hinduism, but Hindu nationalism does not allow them to reach it. It keeps them in what I'm calling intentionally incomplete proximity, because Muslim otherness is the foundational premise of the Hindu nationalist movement. In one passage of the Munch's book, this is Bigots Islam, the cow in Islam, on the left here, the authors describe a story recited by the Sufi saint Khwaja Usman Harwani. Now, the passage describes a mythical mountain that God had built beyond this world, behind which, and I'm quoting now, "There is no darkness, only splendid light. Night does not fall. The ground is made of gold, and those that live there are angels. There is no devil, no heaven, no hell." The day that God created this, all the angels recited the kalima, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah, beautifully. Behind this land there is a veil, behind this veil there is another veil, whose majesty and opulence only God knows. That mountain rests on the head of a cow, whose height is equal of a 30,000-year journey, its head in the east and its tail in the west. Here the Munch is proposing literal Hindu foundations for Islamic theology. In this story, a cow, curated within this Munch text as an allegory for Gomata, the sacred mother cow, holds up God's most beautiful creation. Read within a Munch text about the sanctity of cows, it seems designed as an Islamic justification for cow reverence. This syncretic reverence, in the context of the regular Hindu nationalist vigilante killings of Muslims on suspicions of beef consumption, seems designed to bring Muslims in line without any actual formal inclusion. When we look at the Hindu nationalist audiences for Munch syncretism, so I'm talking about Hindu members of the RSS and the appendages who kind of form the bulk of the audience at these events, what we're seeing is syncretism as a kind of self-referential confirmation of Hindu supremacy. You know, look at all these Muslims doing Hindu things must be great. The audience of these syncretic rituals is Hindu nationalists. Munch news is disseminated on social media platforms dominated by RSS-linked Hindus or in Hindi newspapers linked to the Hindu right. Munch books are almost exclusively written in a highly Sanskritized Hindi, which is unintelligible to most North Indian Muslims. RSS-linked Hindus take pride of place on the dais at all Munch events, often very literally viewing Munch syncretism. Now, the unobjectionable language in which the Munch frames syncretism makes invisible Hindu nationalist domination over Muslims. You know, this is just us mixing in goodwill. How can you object to that? But both the reinscription of Hindu nationalist self-image and the disrespect shown by Hindu leaders towards Islam at their syncretic events are forms of domination. The former uses the alleged neutrality of syncretism to disguise the ways that in any Munch religious synthesis, the most heavily used ingredients are the motifs of violent Hindu nationalism, and the latter mobilises the unobjectionableness of syncretic events marketed as interfaith to neuter any Muslim complaints about Islam's lower ritual status in the Munch. This is a picture of a goat cake, which instead of the traditional animal sacrifice you would do on Bakrid or Eid al-Adha, instead the Munch is advocating to sacrifice a vegetarian cake with a picture of a goat on it instead, so as to respect Brahminical vegetarianism. Muslim syncretism in the Munch only goes one way. It requires Muslims to legitimise an abstracted Hinduism, but that does not require Hindu nationalists to reciprocate. Syncretism is a spectacle, a ritual of subservience that confirms Hindu nationalist self-perception of superiority and power, and is a reminder to Munch Muslims that Islam is something to distance yourself from, at least in its unadulterated form, which is the way this is spoken about within the Munch. This is clear-cut domination and is just another tool in the RSS toolkit for anti-Muslim antagonism. On this terrain, its syncretism in the Munch is a continuation of RSS Islamophobic strategy and not merely some kind of bizarre curiosity. the Munch demonstrates that communal proximity can be a kind of intimate partner violence, where the very closeness of communities is the mechanism of their separation. The consumption of images of subservience through performances of mixture is not limited to religious syncretism, nor indeed to India. In the book, when I talk about subservience, I also examine the case of Palestinians serving in the Israeli Defence Force to discuss these rituals of mixture, for example, multi-ethnic recruitment in the IDF, that actually become rituals of subservience. I won't be able to talk about this much more in detail here, but again, in questions, happy to discuss this. All right, second mechanism. Categorization. Now, the categorization of good Muslims who are Munch members and bad Muslims who are not is the second mechanism of weaponized pluralism. Good Muslims, or supposedly good Muslims, are defined by their membership in the Munch, that is, by their symbolic inclusion into the Hindu rite. When the RSS strategically welcomes all Muslims, knowing full well that almost none will accept, the RSS's manoeuvre actually casts those Muslims who do not join, remember the overwhelming majority of Muslims in India, as obstinate recalcitrants, as the barriers to reducing the duri between communities. The RSS's bad faith inclusion paints Muslims as refusing the extended hand of friendship, despite the fact that the RSS's pluralism does not mark any meaningful moderation in their vitriol. Now, the performance of pluralism through this kind of nominal inclusion advances the bigotry of the RSS in three main ways. Firstly, it creates an intentionally small category of good Muslims that marks all other Muslims, remember, most Muslims, as bad and therefore worthy of attack, or at least critique and challenge. Secondly, this category of good Muslims is a legitimating tool for the RSS, establishing its innocence of Islamophobia by association with Muslims. And finally, this legitimation serves as an obfuscatory tool that provides the RSS a Muslim proxy through which it can continue spreading the same vitriol without undue scrutiny. Now, first though, who are the good Muslims? I speak about this in some depth in the book, but just for our purposes here today, in short, good Muslims are those Muslims in the Munch who are good because of Islam, so using Islamic vocabulary to justify their closeness. Those who are good in spite of being a Muslim, so those who foreground their rational secularity where Islam is just a cultural artifact. And those Muslims who are becoming Hindu, those who regularly engage in these syncretic rituals, who pray to Ram, who don't eat meat. Bad Muslims here will be familiar caricatures, I think, to all of us here, while of course there are some unique South Asian characteristics like the tropes of the invading Arab, Persian or Turk. Most of the caricatures within the RSS and the Munch track pretty closely with those produced through processes of Orientalism and the war on terror. Think these kind of stereotypes of terrorism, illiteracy, violence, misogyny, etc. Anyway, for our purposes today, it's less important to know exactly what these categories contain than it is to know what work they're doing. So for reasons, again, I explain in some detail in the book, this categorization is unlikely to be any kind of divide and rule strategy, certainly not an electoral one, mainly because the Munch is so small and a population of 200 million Muslims is already irrevocably internally diverse and divided. So this kind of divide and rule strategy is not particularly convincing. More plausible than a divide and rule strategy is the use of categorization as a tool to constitute Muslims as a threat. Now, the Munch's limited inclusion of good Muslims solidifies the contours of a threatening bad Muslim spectre, where badness invites punishment. If Muslims in the Munch are good Muslims, then non-Munch members must be bad Muslims and therefore legitimate targets of critique, aggression, marginalisation and violence. The pluralist performances of inclusion of some Muslims then become a tool to exclude most Muslims, a performance entirely consonant with traditional RSS bigotry. Another way that categorization consolidates this bigotry is through the legitimating effect that good Muslims have on the Islamophobic RSS. The RSS's proximity to the Muslims through the Munch supposedly disproves allegations of violent anti-Muslim bigotry. The immediate, visible evidence of RSS association with Muslims through the Munch is available and immediate evidence that says the RSS is not actually Muslim. The RSS may as well ask, oh, how can we be anti-Muslim if we have Muslim friends? The key here is that the Munch, irrespective of its size, its footprint or its popularity, functions as a political talisman whose importance lies in the fact that it exists. This existence then is evidence that can be routinely raised or revived as the most available evidence of the RSS's attitudes towards Muslims. Now, in Delhi, I spoke with Kamal Faruqi, the ex-chairman of the Delhi Minorities Commission and vocal critic of the Munch, and he explained that the Munch, and we're quoting now, projects Muslims as the bad man of the country. Say for any Indian film, we need to have masala. Masala means different ingredients. One ingredient is laughter, one is affection, then there has to be a bad boy. There has to be a villain, and ultimately the villain has to be humiliated, killed or something. And unless you do that, your film will not be successful. So, for the Munch, non-Munch members are the bad boy. In Lucknow, I attended one of Indresh Kumar's addresses at a Munch gathering. Indresh Kumar is this man in the yellow kurta in the middle, who is a very senior RSS leader and one of the founders of the Munch. He is also the accused behind 4 separate bomb blasts on mosques in the mid-2000s, which were responsible for killing over 100 Muslims. And he's the leader of the Muslim wing of the RSS. In this speech, he careened from topic to topic, touching on all the Munch's biggest hits, cow protection, triple talaq, terrorism, brotherhood. Eventually, he kind of meandered towards the topic of history. He said, no Badshah, no Muslim prince has ever created one educational institution. They just built monuments to themselves. Are these the actions of our people or our enemy? Gandhiji went to South Africa and the people there honour him, but they don't say that Gandhiji is our history. Now, Kumar's implication hung very heavily in the air. Were the Muslim Mughals that he was referring to Indian history? Were they the villains or the heroes? He continued, today we are here not at a political mehfil. A mehfil is an evening of courtly entertainment. Oh no, this is a cultural mehfil, a civilizational mehfil. As you all know, political Islam gets into our minds, and if the devil gets into the minds of our children, then the household will be shattered. But don't worry, Satan always stays away from my mehfils. Now, Faruqi's kind of cinematography and Kumar's rhetoric reinforced my experience with the broader Munch, in which there was a clear preoccupation with categorising Muslims as either good or bad, good guys versus bad boys, peace-loving moderates versus extremists, monuments versus hospitals, political Islam versus a cultural mehfil, Satan versus the Munch, good Muslims versus bad Muslims. As with the mechanism of subservience, categorisation is not unique to the RSS. Some of the clearest cases of bigots categorising minorities come from the colonial states of the West, for whom enumerating and categorising minority populations, First Nations populations, was a foundational strategy of discipline and control. In the book project, again, I won't go into too much detail, but I describe how far-right news channel Sky News mobilises categories of good First Nations people in Australia through conservative commentators like Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine in order to legitimise their wholesale assaults on so-called bad First Nations people, which has been their bread and butter for many years. Again, happy to discuss this in the questions. The final mechanism of co-optation, of weaponised pluralism, is co-optation. Now, co-optation is the placement by elites of challengers, however defined, into positions of status quo prestige, like government ministries or development boards, without necessarily providing them with any material power. The Munch then, as challengers, as Muslims who challenge the Hindu nationalist narrative of what India is, the Munch is a pool that the RSS creates from which it draws these Muslim challengers and parachutes them into those government positions that still require a Muslim face. A second dimension of Munch co-optation is when significant non-Munch Muslim community or business leaders are co-opted into the Munch with the offer of rewards. Excuse me. Co-opted Munch Muslims kind of act as proxies of the RSS and become these kind of discrete agents of Hindutva, who because of their Muslimness are not immediately legible as Hindu nationalists and may evade reproach. Co-optation then here, at least in my experience with the Munch, seems to be a mechanism of institutional capture in many ways. This capture serves 2 main functions. First, it very obviously enabled the RSS to determine or influence the policy and pronouncements of traditional Muslim-led institutions, these bastions of resistance to Hindu nationalism. But also, it ensures that increasing numbers of Muslim public figures are RSS loyalists, which shapes the public imagination of what it means to be a Muslim who has made it in India. The RSS then kind of engages in this prefigurative political signification where through its co-opted Muslim leaders, it signals what future Muslims must do to survive in a Hindu state. Now, traditional analyses of co-optation understand it as a reactive process, whereby an oppositional force, like ethnic minorities, social movements, political parties, challenges elites. As a reaction to this challenge, elites notionally include representatives of these challenges into their ranks. In the context of ethnic politics, this inclusion becomes a form of pluralism, whether articulated in the language of diversity, proportional representation, or upliftment. The Munch offers a kind of novel way to look at co-optation where this pool of challenges is in some sense artificial. The RSS created its own challenges, becomes a pool of loyal challenges. Now, when the RSS cultivates leaders in the Munch that take up jobs in the Ministry of Education or Minority Affairs or Muslim minority universities, it is performing pluralism because the inclusion of these minority representatives in these halls of power seems to tick these boxes of diversity and representation. The Hindu right can kind of deflect accusations that it rarely nominates Muslim supporters to positions of power by pointing to the very few that it does and suggesting that those few, rather than the many positions not held by Muslims, are representative of Hindu nationalist attitudes towards Muslims. Now, this first form of co-optation in the Munch is perhaps the most traditional, parachuting Munch members into government positions. The RSS is deeply invested in institutional penetration, and co-opting Munch leaders into Muslim-coded positions is entirely consistent with their broader organisational strategy that they've been pursuing since at least the 1930s. The RSS has recognised and leveraged the importance of having their members and supporters in positions of institutional power. Now, simply put, the positions that Munch members receive are those institutional positions that are coded as Muslim, and through the kind of residues of 20th century Indian liberal pluralism have, as a norm, have always had Muslim faces. So these include leadership of the National Council for the Promotion of Urdu Language, Waqf councils, Hajj committees, and the vice-chancelleries of minority education institutions like Jamia Millia Islamia and Jamia Hamdard in Delhi. Now, the Hajj committees are an interesting example. The smooth running of the Hajj from India to Makkah does not materially kind of affect the RSS one way or the other. There is little strategic benefit in implanting people into these Hajj committees. However, to assume that the RSS thinks only in terms of this only in these cost-benefit terms is to misunderstand and misremember the RSS's ambitions. These ambitions, these hegemonic ambitions are diffuse and sprawling and seek deep societal transformation independent of government intervention. So it's for this reason that the RSS actively works to control small, sports clubs, ice rinks, movie cinemas, neighbourhood groups. These groupings do not concretely advance the RSS agenda, but the RSS is ideologically committed to inserting its fingers into as many figurative pies as possible, even ones as unlikely as the Hajj Committee. I might skip over the second dimension of this just in the interest of time. Similar dynamics to this categorisation this co-optation occur around the world. And in the book, one of the most visible that I talk about are the processes that surround the nomination of African-American candidates, congressional candidates for the Republican Party. In the book, I discuss how the Republican Party co-opts African-American candidates into unwinnable electoral campaigns in order to signify pluralism and inclusion without giving African-Americans any substantial power within the Republican Party. Again, happy to discuss this more in questions. All right, so the argument that I make in this book is not that pluralism is bad or that all pluralist mobilisations are inherently oppressive. Instead, I'm suggesting that pluralism is commensurable with bigotry, that this commensurability creates space for bigots to operate without looking like bigots, and that bigots strategically use this ambivalence to reinforce ethnic and religious hierarchies. Pluralism here becomes a tool. This proposition obviously has certain theoretical and practical implications and provokes the question that if pluralism is commensurable with bigotry, then what faith must we place in traditional responses to bigotry that emphasise pluralist performances like inclusion, tolerance, and mixture? If inclusion can be tokenistic, if tolerance can disguise hostility, and if mixture can erase collective identities, then what does it mean to propose a politics of pluralism as an antidote to the problem of bigotry? It seems that bigots are able to mobilise increasingly sophisticated strategies in the ambivalence between pluralism and bigotry. And I propose that this means that we have to question our automatic recourse to discourses and performances of pluralism as our knee-jerk reaction to bigotry. The usual response to these discontents of pluralism is an attempt to finesse the good pluralisms from the bad pluralisms and pass the ones that work from the ones that don't. I believe that if we seek to pursue pluralist models of difference management as a way to solve the problems of bigotry, we are, despite this passing, bound to fail, because the relationship between pluralism and bigotry is not some Manichaean struggle between good and evil, where in the struggle between these purported opposites, one will prevail. However, believing that pluralism is an inadequate response to bigotry is not the same thing as the discarding of pluralism as a social goal. On the contrary, the spirit that animates this entire project is one that is electrified by a commitment to pluralism, to the social goal of unmolested diversity and the inherent worth of difference. The task of this book is not to propose a good pluralism that picks up where the bad pluralism leaves off. In this book, I am to highlight not that pluralism is fatally flawed, but that we have to be eternally vigilant to the existence of bigotry, even in spaces, even in pluralist spaces where we think it unlikely to appear. We must, of course, pursue the best forms of pluralism, but should do so with the recognition that they may always be used by bigots. In many ways, the Munch and other examples like it are indicators for pluralists to listen from when the call is coming from inside the house. Pluralism is electrifying not in its defeat of bigotry. Pluralism is electrifying because of the future possibilities it promises. And these promises obviously will not include a world without bigotry, as this is a promise that pluralism cannot make. But to date, no model of difference management has been able to make that promise. We must pursue pluralism and forgive the saccharine ending, not for the dragons that we kind of hope it can slay, but because they will always be there, but because of the richness of difference is worthwhile in its own right. Thank you.